The morning sun peeked through the large glass windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. Travelers hurried past one another, dragging suitcases and clutching boarding passes. Among them was Laura Bennett, a flight attendant with Delta Airlines who had been working in the skies for nearly a decade. With her perfectly pressed uniform and practiced smile, she moved gracefully down the narrow aisle of Flight 247, ensuring everything was ready for departure. Laura prided herself on maintaining order during flights. She believed that passengers appreciated efficiency and discipline, and she made sure to enforce the rules without hesitation. Today, however, something, or rather, someone, would test her patience in ways she hadn't anticipated. As passengers began boarding the plane, Laura stood near the entrance, greeting each traveler with a polite nod and a warm, "Welcome aboard." Most people smiled back or mumbled a quick thank you before finding their seats. But then, a young girl stepped onto the aircraft, hesitating just inside the doorway. Her name was Sophie Miller, and this was only her second time flying. Sophie looked around nervously, clutching the strap of her small carry-on bag. At 16 years old, she still carried an air of innocence, her wide brown eyes taking in every detail of the plane's interior. This trip wasn't part of some grand vacation or family outing. It was a rare opportunity. Her father, George Miller, worked as a janitor at the airport, and his employer occasionally offered complimentary tickets to employees' families as a perk. For Sophie, this meant a chance to visit her grandparents in Denver, something she'd dreamed about for months. But now, standing in the crowded aisle of the plane, Sophie felt completely out of place. She glanced at the rows of seats, trying to locate hers, but the numbers blurred together in her anxiety. Passengers behind her started shifting impatiently, muttering under their breath as they waited for her to move forward. Laura noticed the holdup almost immediately. Her brow furrowed as she approached Sophie, her tone sharp and direct. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "This isn't your seat. You're holding up the line." Sophie flinched at the sound of Laura's voice. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they were delivered, with an edge of irritation that made her feel like she didn't belong there at all. She stammered an apology, her cheeks flushing red. I'm sorry," she managed to say. "I'm just looking for my seat." "Well, you need to find it quickly," Laura replied, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Other passengers are waiting." With that, Sophie shuffled further down the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest. She finally found her assigned seat in the middle section of the coach class and sank into it, grateful to be out of sight. But the sting of Laura's words lingered. They echoed in her mind, louder than the hum of engines preparing for takeoff. What bothered Sophie most wasn't just the reprimand, it was the implication behind it. Laura's comment about holding up the line felt like more than just frustration over a minor delay. To Sophie, it carried a deeper meaning, as if she didn't deserve to be there at all. And perhaps in some ways, she understood why Laura might think that. After all, her family couldn't afford luxury vacations or frequent flights. This ticket was a gift, a rare treat, and she knew it. Still, Laura's attitude gnawed at her. Sophie tried to distract herself by gazing out the window, watching ground staff scurry across the tarmac below. But no matter how hard she focused, on the scene outside she couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment that clung to her like a heavy coat. Unbeknownst to anyone else on the plane, Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. During the brief period when electronic devices were permitted before takeoff, she opened her contacts list and scrolled until she found a familiar name. Richard Hayes. The name sent a jolt of nervous energy through her body. Could she really call him? Would he even care? Richard Hayes wasn't just any executive. He was the CEO of Delta Airlines. And while Sophie barely knew him personally, her father did. Years ago, George Miller had saved Richard from slipping on a wet floor at the airport. The two men struck up an unlikely friendship, bonding over shared stories and mutual respect. Over time, Richard became a kind of mentor to George, offering advice and support whenever needed. He even promised that if George or his family ever required assistance, they should reach out directly. Now, sitting in her cramped seat on Flight 247, Sophie wondered if this counted as one of those moments. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. She typed out a short message explaining what had happened, describing Laura's harsh tone and dismissive attitude. Before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. Almost instantly, her phone buzzed with a reply. Sophie stared at the screen, hardly daring to believe what she saw. "Stay where you are," the message read. "I'll handle this." For a moment, Sophie forgot to breathe. She glanced around the cabin, half expecting someone to notice her sudden change in demeanor. But everyone else seemed absorbed in their own worlds, reading magazines, adjusting headphones, or chatting with companions. No one suspected that a quiet revolution was about to unfold, sparked by a single text message from a teenage girl who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. Outside, the engines roared to life, signaling the final preparations for departure. Yet unbeknownst to the passengers and even to Laura Bennett, the wheels of justice were already turning. All because one brave young woman decided to make a call. Richard Hayes sat in his spacious office on the top floor of Delta Airlines headquarters in Atlanta. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of his computer and the occasional buzz of his phone. Richard wasn't one to waste time, even. During what should have been a routine morning of reviewing reports, he kept his focus sharp, ready to tackle whatever came his way. But nothing could have prepared him for the message that appeared on his screen. When Sophie's text popped up, Richard leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing as he read it. He knew George Miller well, knew him as a hard-working man who took pride in his job no matter how tough or thankless it might seem to others. Over the years, Richard had seen firsthand how George carried himself with dignity, even when faced with challenges. And now, reading about how his daughter had been treated on one of Delta's flights, Richard felt a surge of anger. Not just at the situation, but at the idea that someone representing his company could act so callously. Without hesitation, Richard picked up his phone and dialed the operations center overseeing Flight 247. When the controller answered, Richard wasted no time getting to the point. "I need you to delay departure for Flight 247, he said firmly. His tone left no room for argument. The controller hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Sir, is there a mechanical issue or security concerns?" "No," Richard replied. "There's a personnel issue involving one of our employees. That plane isn't leaving until I say so." On the other end of the line, the controller scrambled to process the order. Delays were never taken lightly, especially when they involved fully loaded commercial flights. Still, no one questioned Richard Hayes, not when his word carried the weight of the entire company behind it. Orders were relayed quickly, and within minutes, ground staff at Chicago O'Hare received instructions to hold the plane at the gate indefinitely. Back aboard Flight 247, passengers began to grow restless. The scheduled departure time came and went without explanation, leaving many wondering what was going on. Some craned their necks to look out the windows, hoping to spot any signs of trouble outside. Others muttered complaints under their breath, speculating about everything from weather delays to technical problems. Laura Bennett, still oblivious to the storm brewing around her, continued moving through the cabin, checking seat belts and stowing overhead luggage. Meanwhile, Sophie sat quietly in her seat, gripping her phone tightly. She hadn't expected such a swift response from Richard. Part of her worried that she'd overreacted, that maybe she should have let the incident slide instead of reaching out. But another part of her felt a flicker of hope. For once, someone in power seemed willing to listen, and that realization gave her strength. As the minutes ticked by, the tension inside the plane grew thicker. A few passengers started pressing the call buttons above their seats, summoning flight attendants for answers. Laura found herself fielding question after question, though she had none to give. "We're experiencing a slight delay," she told them repeatedly, her voice calm despite the unease spreading among the travelers. "We'll be airborne soon." But deep down, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why would a delay happen now, moments before takeoff? It didn't make sense, and the lack of information only added to her frustration. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside. focusing instead on maintaining order in the cabin. Outside the plane, airport officials were scrambling to figure out what was causing the holdup. Rumors spread like wildfire among the ground crew, ranging from minor maintenance issues to potential security threats. No one suspected that the source of the problem lay not with the aircraft itself, but with a teenage girl sitting quietly in coach class. Sophie, however, remained painfully aware of the attention her actions had drawn. Every time a new announcement crackled over the intercom or a member of the ground staff passed by her window, she braced herself for what might come next. Would they single her out? Confront her publicly? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of waiting, movement began outside the plane. Ground crew members gathered near the boarding door, speaking urgently into their radios. Then a representative from Delta stepped onto the aircraft, clutching a tablet displaying live footage of the cabin. They scanned the rows carefully, their eyes narrowing as they searched for Sophie. When they finally spotted her, the representative exchanged a few words with the captain before approaching her seat. Sophie's heart raced as she realized she'd been found. "Are you Sophie Miller?" the representative asked softly, leaning down to speak directly to her. Sophie nodded, her throat too dry to form words. The representative offered her a reassuring smile. "Everything's going to be okay," they said. "Just stay seated for now." With that, the representative turned and made their way toward the front of the plane, where Laura was busy assisting another passenger. Without warning, they gestured for her to follow them into the cockpit. Confusion washed over Laura's face as she excused herself and disappeared behind the closed door. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense. The representative wasted no time addressing Laura. "Ms. Bennett," they began, their tone serious, "we've received multiple complaints regarding your conduct toward a passenger earlier today. Can you explain yourself?" Laura blinked, caught completely off guard. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "That girl? She was standing around like she didn't know where she was going." The representative shook their head, their expression unyielding. "Unfortunately, your behavior has caused significant distress. Pending further investigation, you'll need to disembark the aircraft immediately." For a moment, Laura stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. How could this be happening? All she'd done was enforce the rules, something she did every day without issue. And yet here she was being accused of misconduct and ordered off the plane. Humiliated and defensive, Laura stormed out of the cockpit, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she marched down the aisle. Passengers watched in stunned silence as she exited the aircraft, slamming the boarding door behind her. Whispers erupted throughout the cabin, everyone eager to piece together what had just transpired. Sophie, meanwhile, sank lower into her seat, torn between relief and guilt. She hadn't intended for things to escalate this far. All she'd wanted was to feel heard, to prove that she mattered, even if she didn't belong to the world of frequent flyers and luxury vacations. Now, watching the chaos unfold around her, she wondered if she'd made the right choice. But then, as the plane finally began taxiing toward the runway, Sophie allowed herself a small, private smile. For the first time in hours, she felt a sense of peace. Maybe, just maybe, she'd helped shine a light on something important, a reminder that everyone deserved respect, regardless of where they came from or how often they flew. And as the wheels lifted off the ground, carrying her closer to Denver, Sophie resolved to hold on to that lesson forever. The plane finally lifted off the runway, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. The tension that had gripped the aircraft earlier began to ease, replaced by the usual quiet chatter and rustling of magazines. For Sophie Miller, though, the moment was anything but ordinary. She stared out the window at the shrinking city below, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. She couldn't believe it. Laura Bennett, the flight attendant who had made her feel so small, was gone. Not just off the plane, but removed entirely from the flight. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Sophie kept replaying the scene in her head. Laura's sharp words, the delay, the representative stepping aboard, and then Laura being escorted away. What had seemed impossible just hours ago had actually happened. But even as relief washed over her, Sophie couldn't ignore the knot of guilt twisting in her stomach. She hadn't set out to ruin anyone's day or career. All she'd wanted was for someone to acknowledge that she mattered, that she belonged on that plane just as much as anyone else. Now, sitting there in her seat, she wondered if she'd overstepped. Had she caused too much trouble? Would people judge her for speaking up? Her thoughts were interrupted when the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during the delay. We're now cruising at our planned altitude and expect smooth skies ahead. On behalf of Delta Airlines, I apologize for the inconvenience and assure you that we take matters like this very seriously." The announcement sent a ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly while others whispered theories about what exactly had transpired. A few turned their heads toward Sophie, curious if she might have answers. But Sophie kept her gaze fixed on the window, pretending not to notice. She didn't want to explain herself. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As the hours passed, the atmosphere aboard the plane shifted. Conversations became lighter, laughter bubbled up here and there, and the earlier tension dissolved almost completely. Some passengers even approached the remaining flight attendants to commend them for handling the situation professionally. It was clear that whatever had happened, most people agreed it needed to be addressed. Sophie tried to focus on the positives. She reminded herself that standing up for herself wasn't wrong, it was necessary. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on her, watching her every move. When the flight attendants came around offering drinks and snacks, Sophie accepted a bottle of water with a quiet, "Thank you," avoiding eye contact as much as possible. By the time the plane began its descent into Denver, Sophie's nerves had calmed somewhat. She gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, eager to leave the drama behind. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she spotted her grandparents waiting for her near baggage claim. Their faces lit up when they saw her, waving enthusiastically. For the first time all day, Sophie allowed herself to smile genuinely. Her grandmother pulled her into a tight hug. "We heard your flight was delayed. Is everything okay?" Sophie hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, she shrugged. "It was, complicated, but I'm fine now." Her grandfather raised an eyebrow. "Complicated, huh? Well, let's get you home. You can tell us all about it over dinner." On the drive to their house, Sophie debated whether to open up about what had happened. Part of her wanted to keep it private, to put the whole ordeal behind her. But another part knew she couldn't ignore it. Not entirely. So, haltingly, she began to recount the events of the day. Laura's harsh words, the text to Richard Hayes, the delay, and Laura's removal from the flight. Her grandparents listened intently, their expressions shifting between concern and pride. "You did the right thing," her grandmother said firmly once Sophie finished. "No one should treat you or anyone else that way." Her grandfather nodded in agreement. "That's right, standing up for yourself takes courage, kiddo, don't forget that." Their words brought tears to Sophie's eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them until that moment. For the rest of the evening, they talked about everything except the flight, filling the house with warmth and laughter. By bedtime, Sophie felt lighter, as if she'd left pieces of the day's weight behind. Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Richard Hayes sat in his office reflecting on the incident. He had followed up with operations staff to ensure the situation was handled appropriately, and he'd already requested a full report from the team investigating Laura's conduct. But beyond the logistics, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Sophie and George. He picked up his phone and dialed George's number. After a few rings, George answered, his voice warm and familiar. "Richard, to what do I owe this call?" "George, it's about Sophie," Richard began, choosing his words carefully. "She reached out to me today about an uncomfortable situation on one of our flights. I wanted to let you know personally that we're looking into it, and I appreciate her having the courage to speak up." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then George spoke, his tone softening. "Thank you for telling me, Richard. I'll talk to her about it. But honestly, I'm not surprised she stood her ground. That girl's got more strength than she realizes." Richard smiled. "I can see where she gets it from." After hanging up, Richard leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. Stories like Sophie's reminded him why he cared so deeply about leading Delta Airlines. It wasn't just about planes and routes, it was about people. Every passenger who boarded one of his company's flights deserved to feel valued, respected, and safe. And if someone fell short of those standards, it was his responsibility to fix it. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread quietly among Delta employees. While official statements remained vague, word trickled down through the ranks about a confrontation involving a flight attendant and a young passenger. Speculation ran rampant, but one detail stood out. The passenger had direct access to Richard Hayes himself. That fact alone sent a clear message throughout the organization. No matter who you were or what position you held, accountability mattered. For Sophie, life in Denver quickly returned to normal. She spent her days exploring the city with her grandparents, visiting museums, hiking trails, and indulging in her favorite foods. Yet despite the distractions, she found herself reflecting on the flight often. Each time she thought about it, she felt a little stronger, a little braver. She realized that standing up for herself hadn't just changed her, it had sparked something bigger, something meaningful. One afternoon, while scrolling through her phone, Sophie noticed a new message from Richard Hayes. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. "Sophie, thank you again for reaching out. Your courage reminds us all why respect is so important. Safe travels and give my best to your dad." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she read the words. She hadn't expected gratitude from someone like Richard Hayes, but his message meant more to her than she could express. It validated everything she'd felt that day. The frustration, the embarrassment, the determination to be heard. And it gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd helped make a difference. When Sophie returned home to Chicago a week later, her father greeted her with open arms. "How was your trip?" he asked, pulling her into a hug. "It was amazing," Sophie replied, smiling despite the memories of the flight. "But I'll tell you all about it later. Right now, I just want to enjoy being home." George chuckled. "Fair enough. Welcome back, kiddo." That night, as Sophie lay in bed replaying the trip in her mind, she realized something important. The flight hadn't defined her journey. It had simply been a chapter in it. A challenging, unexpected chapter, yes, but one that taught her valuable lessons about standing tall, speaking up, and believing in herself. And for that, she was grateful. The days following Sophie's return to Chicago passed quickly, but the memory of her flight lingered like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. At first, she tried to push it out of her mind, focusing instead on schoolwork, friends, and helping her father around the house. But no matter how busy she kept herself, thoughts of Laura Bennett and the events on Flight 247 crept back into her mind whenever she had a quiet moment. Sophie knew she hadn't done anything wrong by standing up for herself. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what others thought of her actions. Had they seen her as brave or just troublesome? She replayed snippets of conversations in her head, imagining different outcomes if she'd stayed silent or handled things differently. It was exhausting, this constant tug-of-war between pride and doubt. One evening, while helping her dad clean up after dinner, George noticed the faraway look in his daughter's eyes. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently, setting down a dish towel. "Something on your mind?" Sophie hesitated, unsure where to begin. Finally, she sighed and told him everything, from Laura's harsh words to the text she sent to Richard Hayes, and even the guilt she felt afterward. As she spoke, tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. George pulled her into a hug, letting her cry without interruption. When she finally calmed down, he leaned back and looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Sophie," he said softly, "what you did took guts. Not everyone would have had the courage to speak up like that. "But what if I made things worse?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "What if people think I'm just causing drama?" George shook his head firmly. "No one gets to tell you how to feel about being treated unfairly. You stood up for yourself because you deserved better. That's not drama, that's strength." His words struck a chord deep within Sophie. For the first time since the flight, she allowed herself to fully embrace the truth. She hadn't caused trouble, she demanded respect. And that was something worth holding on to. Meanwhile, Delta Airlines was undergoing its own transformation. In the wake of the incident, Richard Hayes wasted no time addressing the issue internally. He called an emergency meeting with senior executives and department heads, emphasizing the importance of accountability and empathy in customer service. "We're here to serve people, not judge them," he said sternly. "Every passenger deserves to feel welcome, regardless of their background or circumstances." To ensure these values were upheld moving forward, Richard ordered a company-wide review of employee training programs. New modules focused on conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and professionalism were added to the curriculum. Employees were encouraged to share feedback anonymously if they witnessed behavior inconsistent with Delta's standards. Laura Bennett, meanwhile, faced disciplinary action. After a thorough investigation, which included interviews with passengers and crew members from Flight 247, Delta decided to suspend her pending further evaluation. While some colleagues defended her, arguing that she was simply doing her job, others acknowledged that her tone and attitude had crossed a line. For Laura, the suspension came as a shock. She had always prided herself on efficiency and strict adherence to protocol, believing those qualities made her a model employee. Now, faced with the consequences of her actions, she struggled to reconcile her self-image with the reality of the situation. Was she truly at fault, or had she been unfairly singled out? Her frustration only deepened when she attended a mandatory counseling session as part of her reinstatement process. The counselor, a kind but firm woman named Margaret, challenged Laura to reflect on her interactions with passengers. "Think about how your words and actions might affect someone else," Margaret urged. "Even if you don't mean harm, perception matters." At first, Laura resisted the idea, convinced she was being blamed for something beyond her control. But as the sessions progressed, she began to see glimpses of herself through other people's eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, she admitted that perhaps she had let her frustrations get the better of her. It wasn't an easy realization, but it marked the beginning of a long journey toward change. Back in Chicago, Sophie's story continued to unfold in unexpected ways. One afternoon, as she walked home from school, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Delta Airlines, addressed directly to her. Curious, she opened it and began reading. "Dear Sophie Miller, on behalf of Delta Airlines, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the experience you endured on Flight 247. Your courage in bringing this matter to our attention has prompted meaningful discussions within our organization. We are committed to ensuring that all passengers feel respected and valued, and we thank you for helping us hold ourselves accountable. Sincerely, Richard Hayes, CEO." Sophie stared at the screen, her heart swelling with emotion. She hadn't expected such a formal acknowledgement, let alone gratitude. It felt surreal, like a validation of everything she'd gone through. For so long, she'd doubted whether speaking up had made a difference, but now she knew it had. That evening, Sophie shared the email with her dad, who read it with a proud smile. "See?" he said, nudging her playfully. "I told you. You're making waves, kiddo." Sophie laughed, though there was still a hint of disbelief in her voice. "I didn't mean to make waves," she admitted. "I just wanted to be treated fairly." "And that's exactly why it matters," George replied. "Sometimes fairness needs a little push." As weeks turned into months, Sophie found herself growing more confident. The incident on the plane became less of a burden and more of a reminder of her own strength. She carried that lesson with her everywhere, in class, on the soccer field, and even during family gatherings. Whenever she faced challenges or moments of self-doubt, she reminded herself of the girl who refused to stay silent. Word of Sophie's story spread quietly among Delta employees too. Though official details remained confidential, rumors circulated about a young passenger who had stood up to mistreatment and succeeded. To many, it served as a powerful example of why compassion and respect should always come first. For Richard Hayes, Sophie's actions reinforced his belief in the importance of listening to customers. He made it a point to mention her story during leadership meetings, using it as a case study for how feedback, no matter how uncomfortable, could drive positive change. We owe it to our passengers to create an environment where they feel safe. Speaking up, he often said, because sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. By spring, Delta announced several new initiatives aimed at improving customer experience. Flyers noticed subtle changes. Flight attendants greeted them with warmer smiles. Announcements sounded friendlier, and staff seemed genuinely eager to assist. Behind the scenes, employees participated in workshops designed to foster empathy and understanding. While progress took time, the shift was undeniable. Sophie noticed the difference when she flew again later that year, this time to visit her aunt in Florida. From check-in to landing, every interaction felt smoother, kinder. As she settled into her seat, she smiled to herself, knowing she'd played a small part in sparking that change. When the plane touched down in Miami, Sophie stepped off feeling lighter than ever. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was someone who had helped remind a global airline of its core values. And though life moved forward, carrying her toward new adventures and challenges, she knew one thing for certain. Standing up for herself had changed everything. For her, for Delta, and for countless others who traveled the skies. Months had passed since Sophie Miller's flight to Denver, but the ripple effects of her actions continued to spread far beyond what she, or anyone else, could have imagined. Sophie herself had moved on with her life, focusing on school, friends, and spending time with her family. Yet every now and then reminders of that day would surface, pulling her back to the moment when she decided to speak up. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Sophie sat in the living room helping her dad organize old photo albums, the doorbell rang. George went to answer it, returning moments later with a thick envelope in hand. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Sophie with a puzzled expression. Sophie examined the envelope curiously. It bore the Delta Airlines logo, and her name was printed neatly in the corner. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, revealing a handwritten letter from Richard Hayes along with 2 round-trip tickets to any destination Delta served. The letter read, "Dear Sophie, as we continue to grow and improve as a company, I want to personally thank you once again for your courage and honesty. Your story has inspired countless employees to reflect on their roles and responsibilities, not just as representatives of Delta, but as human beings. Enclosed are tickets for you and your family to use whenever you'd like. Consider it a small token of our gratitude. You've reminded us all that respect and kindness should always come first. Sincerely, Richard Hayes." Sophie stared at the tickets, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't expected anything like this, a gift so generous, so unexpected. For a moment, she couldn't find the words to express how she felt. All she could do was hug her dad tightly, tears streaming down her face. "This is incredible," George murmured, his voice filled with awe. "You've done something truly special, Sophie." Though Sophie initially hesitated to accept the tickets, she eventually realized they weren't just a reward, they were an invitation. An invitation to keep traveling, exploring and embracing opportunities without fear. With her family's encouragement, she decided to plan a trip to New York City during winter break, eager to create new memories in a place she'd always dreamed of visiting. Meanwhile, within Delta Airlines, Sophie's influence continued to shape the company culture. Employee training sessions now included a module titled Lessons from Our Passengers, which highlighted real-life examples of how customer feedback had driven positive change. Sophie's story became a cornerstone of these discussions, serving as a powerful reminder that even the smallest voices could spark meaningful transformation. Flight attendants, gate agents, and ground staff began approaching their work with renewed purpose. They learned to listen more closely, smile more genuinely, and treat each passenger as an individual rather than just another seat number. Some employees admitted they'd never thought much about how their tone or body language might affect someone until hearing about Sophie's experience. Now they made a conscious effort to ensure every interaction left a positive impression. Laura Bennett, who had returned to work after completing her suspension and counseling sessions, found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she resented the scrutiny she'd faced. On the other, she recognized the value of the lessons she'd been forced to confront. Over time, she started making subtle changes in her behavior, taking extra care to greet passengers warmly, offering assistance proactively, and pausing before reacting to stressful situations. Her colleagues noticed the shift, though few commented on it directly. One evening, while working alongside Laura on a late-night flight, a fellow flight attendant named Karen pulled her aside. "You've been doing great lately," Karen said quietly. "I can tell you're trying, and it shows." Laura nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, "but I'm learning." Karen smiled. "That's all anyone can ask for." As the holiday season approached, Delta launched a campaign called Fly with Kindness. Posters featuring heartfelt messages adorned airport terminals across the country, encouraging travelers to treat one another with compassion and understanding. The campaign also included videos showcasing stories of resilience, unity, and connection among passengers and employees alike. Unbeknownst to Sophie, her story served as the inspiration behind the entire initiative. When the commercials aired on television, Sophie's family gathered around the couch to watch. At first, none of them realized the connection, until a narrator mentioned, "A young passenger reminded us all that fairness begins with listening." George turned to Sophie with wide eyes. "Is this—" Sophie nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I guess they really meant it when they said my story mattered," her younger brother teased her good-naturedly. "So, does this mean you're famous now?" Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "Not exactly. But maybe it means people are paying attention." The campaign resonated deeply with audiences, sparking conversations about empathy and accountability not just in aviation, but in everyday life. Social media lit up with hashtags like Fly with Kindness and Listen to Passengers, as travelers shared their own experiences, both positive and negative, of flying. Some praised Delta for its efforts, while others challenged other airlines to follow suit. For Sophie, seeing her story woven into something larger than herself was overwhelming yet humbling. She didn't crave recognition, but knowing her actions had contributed to a broader movement gave her a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. In December, Sophie and her family boarded their flight to New York City using the tickets Richard Hayes had sent. From the moment they arrived at the airport, they noticed a difference in the atmosphere. Check-in agents greeted them with genuine smiles. Security personnel offered helpful tips to speed up the process, and flight attendants went out of their way to make everyone feel comfortable. During the flight, Sophie struck up a conversation with a woman sitting next to her. The woman, a teacher named Margaret, marveled at how smoothly everything had gone. "Delta's really stepped up their game," she remarked. "It feels like they actually care." Sophie smiled, resisting the urge to reveal her role in the changes. Instead, she simply nodded. "Yeah, it does feel different." Once they landed in New York, Sophie and her family dove headfirst into the city's energy. They visited iconic landmarks like Times Square and Central Park, explored museums, and indulged in delicious food from street vendors and cozy diners alike. Every experience felt magical, made even sweeter by the knowledge that this trip wouldn't have happened without Sophie's courage months earlier. On their final night in the city, as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, Sophie stood atop the Empire State Building, gazing out at the glittering skyline. Her dad joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Pretty amazing view, huh?" he said softly. It really is, Sophie replied, her voice tinged with wonder. I never thought standing up for myself would lead to all this. George squeezed her shoulder. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't just change your life. It changes the world around you too. Sophie let those words sink in, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She knew challenges lay ahead, both big and small, but she also knew she had the strength to face them. After all, she'd already proven that speaking up, even when it was scary, could make a difference. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of a new year, Sophie made a silent promise to herself. No matter where life took her, she would always strive to be kind, brave, and true to who she was. Because sometimes the smallest acts of courage could leave the biggest impact. The new year brought fresh beginnings, not just for Sophie Miller but for countless others who had been touched, directly or indirectly, by her actions. Sophie returned to Chicago after her trip to New York City with a renewed sense of purpose. The bustling streets and towering skyscrapers of Manhattan had left an indelible mark on her, but it wasn't the sights or sounds that stayed with her most. It was the realization that her voice mattered, that standing up for herself had sparked a chain reaction far beyond what she could have imagined. Back home, life settled into its usual rhythm. Sophie attended school, helped her dad around the house, and spent weekends hanging out with friends. Yet every now and then, she'd catch snippets of conversations or see news headlines about Delta Airlines' Fly with Kindness campaign. Each mention reminded her that her courage had planted a seed, one that continued to grow in unexpected ways. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Sophie stumbled upon a post from a woman named Emily Carter. In the caption, Emily described how a Delta flight attendant had gone above and beyond to help her during a difficult time. Her young son had been crying uncontrollably due to ear pain during takeoff, and instead of brushing it off as typical toddler behavior, the attendant brought him a warm towel, offered soothing words, and even knelt beside him to distract him with games. Emily ended her post with a heartfelt message. This is what kindness looks like. Thank you, Delta, for reminding us that compassion still exists. Beneath the photo were hundreds of comments from other passengers sharing similar stories of empathy and care. Sophie read through them, her heart swelling with pride. She didn't know if these changes were directly tied to her experience, but she liked to think they were part of the same ripple effect. At Delta Airlines, the cultural shift initiated by Sophie's story became ingrained in the company's identity. Employees embraced the idea that their roles extended beyond technical duties. They were ambassadors of kindness, tasked with ensuring every passenger felt valued. Training programs evolved to include role-playing exercises where staff practiced handling difficult situations with patience and understanding. Managers encouraged open dialogue, creating spaces where employees could share challenges and successes without fear of judgment. Richard Hayes remained at the forefront of these efforts, using his position to champion accountability and empathy. He often reflected on Sophie's courage, marveling at how a single act of bravery could inspire so much change. During a leadership conference held in Atlanta, he shared her story with attendees, emphasizing the importance of listening to customers and learning from their experiences. We serve people, not planes, Richard told the audience. Every interaction matters because behind each ticket is a human being with hopes, fears, and dreams. Let's never forget that. His speech earned a standing ovation, and afterward, several executives approached him to express their admiration for Sophie's impact. One airline CEO even joked, "You've set the bar pretty high for the rest of us, Richard." Richard chuckled but quickly grew serious. It's not about setting bars. It's about doing what's right. If a 16-year-old girl can teach us all a lesson about respect, imagine what else we can achieve if we listen more closely. For Laura Bennett, the journey toward self-improvement remained ongoing. Though she had initially struggled to accept responsibility for her actions, the counseling sessions and support from colleagues gradually helped her see things differently. She began viewing her role not as a gatekeeper of rules, but as a facilitator of comfort and connection. Every smile she offered, every kind word she spoke, reminded her why she had chosen this career in the first place. One day, While working a morning flight, Laura encountered a nervous young traveler, a boy around 10 years old flying alone for the first time. His hands trembled as he clutched his boarding pass and his eyes darted around the cabin uncertainly. Laura knelt beside him, her tone gentle and reassuring. "Hi there," she said warmly. "First time flying solo?" The boy nodded shyly. "Yeah, my mom says it'll be okay, but I'm kinda scared." Laura smiled. "You're going to do great. And guess what? You've got me looking out for you today. We'll make sure everything goes smoothly, okay?" By the end of the flight, the boy was grinning ear to ear, chatting animatedly with Laura about his favorite video games. As he waved goodbye before disembarking, Laura felt a surge of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, she truly enjoyed her job. Not because it was easy, but because it allowed her to make a difference. Sophie's story also inspired others outside the aviation industry. Teachers incorporated it into classroom discussions about standing up for oneself and treating others with respect. Community leaders referenced it during workshops on conflict resolution and advocacy. Even local newspapers featured articles, highlighting the power of individual action to drive systemic change. One day, Sophie received an email from a high school student named Mia Thompson. Mia wrote about how she'd been bullied at school and felt too afraid to speak up, until she heard Sophie's story online. "Reading about what you did gave me the courage to tell someone," Mia explained. "Now things are getting better for me, and I wanted to say thank you." Sophie read the email multiple times, tears streaming down her face. She replied immediately, offering words of encouragement and reminding Mia that she wasn't alone. Their exchange marked the start of an unexpected friendship, one built on mutual support and shared resilience. As spring arrived, Sophie found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful flight. She realized that while the incident itself had been painful, it had ultimately led to growth, for her, for Delta, and for countless strangers whose paths she'd unknowingly influenced. She no longer viewed the experience as something to move past. Instead, she saw it as a defining moment that shaped who she was becoming. Her dad noticed the shift in her demeanor, too. "You seem different lately," he remarked one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. "More confident, maybe?" Sophie paused, brushing dirt off her hands. "I think I finally understand that standing up for myself doesn't mean I'm causing trouble. It means I'm worth fighting for." George smiled proudly. "That's my girl." By summer, Delta announced plans to expand its Fly with Kindness initiative globally, partnering with organizations dedicated to promoting inclusivity and empathy. The company also introduced a scholarship program aimed at helping students pursue careers in aviation, naming it the Courage in the Skies Scholarship, in honor of Sophie's bravery. When Richard Hayes called to inform Sophie about the scholarship, she was speechless. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Richard replied kindly. "Just keep being you. That's more than enough." Years later, as Sophie prepared to graduate high school, she looked back on her journey with gratitude. The shy, uncertain girl who had once hesitated aboard Flight 247 had grown into someone unafraid to use her voice. She knew challenges would always arise, but she also knew she had the strength to face them head-on. On graduation day, as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Sophie spotted her dad cheering loudly from the audience. Beside him sat Richard Hayes, who had flown in to celebrate her achievements. Their presence filled her with warmth, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this world. Afterward, during a quiet moment backstage, Richard pulled Sophie aside. "You've come a long way," he said, his eyes twinkling. "And I have no doubt you'll continue to inspire people wherever you go." Sophie smiled, feeling a mix of humility and determination. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly. "But really, I just hope others feel brave enough to believe in themselves, too." As the sun set over the horizon, casting golden light across the crowd, Sophie stood tall, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. She knew the road wouldn't always be smooth, but she also knew she had the tools to navigate it. with kindness, courage, and an unwavering belief in the power of standing up for what was right.